Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hello and welcome to episode 335 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm Rory and my guest today is James Hawes, a psychotherapist, supervisor, trainer, speaker, coach and the author of The Secret Lives of Men. Today, James will share insights from his book and discuss how understanding the unique aspects of masculinity can help therapists better support and connect with male clients. And with that said, roll the intro.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 335 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Both my colleague Rory Oakes and myself, Ken Kelly, are delighted to welcome you to our three topics today, starting off with ethical sustainable practice, where today we dive deep into extra-therapeutic factors in supervision. It really is an interesting topic. I think you're going to enjoy that one. And Rory has already beautifully teed up our guest today, which is James Hawes, supporting and connecting with male clients. We're going to be going into that, into Practice Matters. And then after that, student services, ending by looking at you, our students, on your formal journey. And today we're going to be speaking about how to start a counselling session with a client. What do we do right in the beginning? But back to the beginning, to that ethical, sustainable practice, Rory. Extra-therapeutic factors in supervision. So what are extra-therapeutic factors?
Well, extra-therapeutic factors are those elements that are outside therapy. So just a little background to this. In 1992, a psychologist called Michael Lambert undertook a huge research project to try and work out how therapy worked, what made therapy have the best outcomes for clients. And he came up with something called Lambert's pie. It's not something you can go to the shop and buy. It's a pie chart talking about what factors influence positive outcomes in therapy. And in that, he said that client variables and extra therapeutic events made up 40% of positive outcomes. So in supervision, it's really important that we think about elements outside of therapy. And for those of you who've been in supervision, practicing counsellors, you may recall that sometimes your supervisor says to you, what's going on around this client? What's happening externally from the therapy room? What support has this person got in place? How's this person coping with this and that? And interestingly enough, that's a deliberate practice from a supervisor to gain a sense of what support systems are in place externally. So I will give you an example. If you've got a client who's going through a difficult time but has a good friendship group, very solid family, is looking after themselves, then almost certainly they're going to have probably a better outcome in therapy than someone who hasn't got that external support. Basically, what it's saying is that therapy just doesn't all happen in the therapy room. It's not about the therapy, all about the therapy room. It's about what's going on externally from the therapy room that's supporting the client in a transition, because all therapy is a transition, moving into maybe a new way of thinking or adapting to a new circumstance, Ken.
Wow. That's a beautiful introduction. And there's two sides to this, I think, Rory, for me, when I was researching this topic and diving deep. There is, as a supervisor, we're looking and considering the extra-therapeutic factors in supervision for the clients that a supervisee might bring. So we're asking about their greater lives, as you've beautifully introduced. But we're also looking out for the lives and what's going on in the lives of our supervisees as well. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there, where we're looking out for both of it. And I guess if you're not a supervisor, then you can listen to the point of, are you thinking of this when you're working with your clients, thinking about the external lives within that? And I think it's really, really important, because it kind of keys into the hierarchy of needs for me. So if you think about the basics that are needed, like protection and security, and maybe food and water, and the basic needs that we have, if you remove those from a person's life, it is unlikely that they're going to engage in meaningful therapy. Why? Because external factors within their life are influencing how they can connect within therapy and how that process may go. And I know that's a very extreme case of this, but there are other factors that happen in our clients' lives that can help or hinder the therapeutic process. And it's interesting that there is another version of this which is spoken about in recovery. So that's drug and alcohol and gambling recovery, so addiction recovery. And it's called recovery capital. And the evidence clearly shows that despite the treatment model that is used, what is a great factor in determining long-term abstinence or recovery from what the person presents with is recovery capital. And it's the factors of their life. Do they have meaningful relationships in their life? Do they have a healthy life? And looking at, I guess, not just the person and the narrative, but who they are, how they live, what's going on for them, so that all becomes part of the therapeutic process.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put, Ken. And I like that, the idea of having capital, in other words, having a reserve that will allow someone to fall back on emotionally, a bit like having a kind of an emotional bank account you can draw on if you're not getting a general emotional input. And that could be, if someone's going through a very difficult relational breakup, it might be that they're getting the warmth and kindness and love from their friends and their family, and that's supporting them. Or even things like financial stability. If someone's lost the job and they're very worried about that, I would imagine it's a heck of a lot easier to be in therapy and be able to look at self if if you can support yourself through that transition. If you're literally thinking you're going to be made homeless at any minute, then it's very, very difficult, I think, in therapy to focus on self. And I also think that you touched very correctly, Ken, on a supervisor checking out the counsellor's own well-being, because this is important as well. We know that things like burnout, stress, and some clients can really test our emotional resilience. So it's really useful for a supervisor just to check in how is the supervisee doing some of that sort of process, that normative, formative, and restorative, the restorative side of things, making sure that they're taking time for themselves, because counselling is a demanding profession. I also think it encourages reflexivity. I can't tell you how many supervisees that I've worked with who really blame themselves if clients don't turn up, or clients aren't getting what they perceive. And this is always a danger, I think, for therapists to judge progress by their own frame of reference. Progress should always be judged by how the client thinks they're progressing. But they might say, well, this client's not turned up, or they're not doing very well, or I've tried my very best. And I think by a supervisor saying to a supervisor, well, look, what's the outside support like? What's happening in their lives? I think it can be, if not reassuring, can show that people who have lives where they're supported externally are more likely to get a bigger benefit from therapy. It may be harsh, but in my experience, it's a kind of strong truth, Ken.
Yeah, of course. And it's interesting. So we speak about psychological contact, and certainly if you follow the person-centered approach to counseling, it's recognized as being necessary within a therapeutic relationship. And what psychological contact basically is, it's the fact that the person coming in for the therapy knows why they're there. They are engaging because they want to be there, and it's that personal motivation from the client. So that is something that we can think about. And I say this because I know you've worked in an education setting before, in a school setting, Rory. I've worked in a college setting before, and sometimes you'll get somebody coming in because they've been told, you better go and see the counselor now. You need some counselling. They're coming in. Well, there's very little chance of having any deep, meaningful therapeutic relationship if somebody is coming in from that point of not particularly wanting to engage. So that's an external factor that is vital to the relationship. So it just shows that who that person is, their mindset, their social support that is around them, their personal motivation, their own coping abilities, meaningful events within their life are all going to be part of who they are when they sit down as a client. In the same way as the supervisee, when coming to supervision, also brings all of that within themselves. We've got a great handout on this as well that you can really deep dive into. And one of the things I was looking over is why this is done in supervision. And the points we got here are the counselor's own well-being, burnout, personal stress, emotional resilience, personal effectiveness, how effective that counselor can be with their client. So as a supervisor, you're looking out for that. And then, of course, client social support, relationships with family, friends, community networks play a crucial role in their progress. So don't be surprised, I guess, if your supervisor starts asking about your client's life outside of just the therapy narrative that is being brought. And this is, I guess, the spotlight on why that is important for us as going to supervision, but it's also important for us when we're working with our clients, Rory. A very, very interesting topic.
It is a very interesting topic, and I think also it's an encouragement for collaboration. Sometimes therapy itself is part of a wider kind of endeavour where clients might engage with other professionals, social services or medical professionals or community resources. You spoke very eloquently about the recovery community, Ken. That would be a really good example where someone might have counselling, but they may have some other form of support put in place. They may have medical issues, they may need housing and that type of thing, community resources. So I think that part of the supervisor's job is to try to take that 30,000 foot view of what's going on between the client and the counsellor, and maybe suggest maybe some form of referral pathways if it's quite clear that what's being discussed in therapy and what the client hopes to get from therapy isn't something that a therapist can deliver. So an example of that is someone who may be wanting to recover from alcohol, severe alcohol use. It might be that although therapy may be very helpful to discuss the reasons that they're overusing alcohol, it may be there's another piece of support that can be put in place to help them if they really want to withdraw from alcohol use. So yeah, supervisors do ask these questions, and I'm wondering how many people listening out there are going to say, oh, so that's why my supervisor asked those questions. I never really knew. I just kind of answered them, but never really got really understood why they were so interested in what was going on externally of the client Well, now you
Yes.
know.
Yes, or then you may be listening to this and going, but my supervisor never covers those areas. In which
Yes.
case, both sides of that coin are interesting. And kind of as we led into this, I spoke about the two sides of the coin. One, we're looking at this through the lens of being a supervisor and working with a supervisee. But the other side of it, if you're not a supervisor as a counselor, how are you bringing this into your client work? I guess. And if you are interested in becoming a supervisor, counsellingtutor.com, we have a clinical supervision training course there, which is first rate. And one of the things we hear so often, Rory, is how individuals will take the supervision training course and say that it really impacted how they choose to practice. So it really does grow your awareness and how you look at your own practice. So practical strategies for supervisors, this is kind of the last bit on the handout that we have, and I'll give you the address for that in a moment, is to create a safe space for reflection, holding that safe place so that your supervisee can come in and feel safe to be able to share what is going on for them. Access workload and self-care, looking at the workload, how many clients that the supervisee is seeing, how they are taking breaks and looking after themselves. Encourage collaboration. You went into that just now, Rory. That is so important that we speak about what's going on for us as counsellors with our supervisor, bringing in the more challenging aspects of our lives if they are there, so that they're on the table, not hidden away. And model awareness of extra-therapeutic factors, which is what we're talking about today, knowing that it exists and that it is part of what we do. And then this is an important one, provide guidance on resilience and adaptation. And, as counselors, we don't always guide and advise our clients. That not all models work that way. Specifically person-centered, you might not be directing, but there are times, when we recognize what is going on within a client's life might fall outside of our competence range or our ability to be able to help with that. And this is where our referral network and our little referral book comes in really handy, so that we can maybe deliver a little bit of psychological education and maybe a referral pathway to how a person might engage in something if it does fall outside of our competence, but definitely has an impact on maybe the therapeutic relationship or journey. Any final thoughts on this, Rory, before we point to the handout?
Yeah, I think that if you are interested, look up Lambert's pie, which is a massive piece of research. I believe that Mick Cooper has just produced or has published a parallel research which shows much the same as Lambert came up with in 1992, that therapy is a pie with many slices, and there are many aspects to successful therapy. So have a look at Lambert's pie, and just see. And one of the things you might find and may find surprising is within that pie, the therapeutic modality is only 15% of the overall success of therapy. So that could be quite eye-opening for a lot of therapists. But it's proven research. It's been around for a long time. It keeps getting re-brought out in research. You keep going back to the research and keep finding the same thing. So I think it's really interesting. And I think if you're a supervisor, I think most supervisors should know what Lambert's pie is personally, even if you can't buy it from the shop, Ken.
Well, I'm very happy to say there is a reference in the handout where you can go and dive a little bit deeper into this. So this is why considering extra-therapeutic factors in supervision is important for counsellors. You can get that handout by going to counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcast tab, go to episode 335, and it's right there. You can download it. It's free of charge. And that handout is available for you with the references. And if you're interested in training to be a counselling supervisor, counsellingtutor.com, all the information is there. And that is ethical, sustainable practice. We now move on, of course, to practice matters, which it certainly does. It's interesting when you were just saying, Rory, that 15% of the effectiveness of therapy lies in what we do in our modality. Oh, my goodness me. Yeah. But practice still matters. I'm sticking with that. Practice matters. It's the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor podcast. Rory, you had an interview with James Hawes around supporting and connecting with male clients.
Yes, it's always wonderful to meet a passionate advocate in a certain discipline, and James Hawes certainly is that. He's written a book called The Secret Lives of Men, and he approaches the book from a therapeutic perspective. We are, as a gender or a sex, quite hard to help. You know, the suicide rates of men are alarmingly high, and men tend not to ask for help. So when they do, it's really important that we know how to work with them and understand the psychology of men. I caught up with James. He talks about this as well as aspects from his book, and this is what he had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Masculinity is often misunderstood, both in society and in the therapy room. As therapists, we know that working with male clients can sometimes present unique challenges, from emotional expression to navigating vulnerability. But what if we could gain deeper insights into men's inner worlds, what they think, feel, and often struggle to articulate? To explore this, I'm joined today by James Hawes, an expert in men's mental health and the author of The Secret Life of Men. James brings a wealth of experience in supporting male clients and helping therapists better understand men's psychological and emotional lives. So, James, thank you for joining us, and you're very welcome.
Brilliant, Rory. Well, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our chat today.
Yes, and I guess one of the things that I've noticed through the arc of my practice was that men often struggle to open up in therapy. And I wonder what we can do as therapists to create a space where men feel safe enough to engage.
Yeah, I mean, this is the big one, isn't it? I mean, now look, I've been working with men for over 20 years now in therapy. 95% of my clients are male, and there is a sense that men not generally got the language of emotions, feelings. They're not really sure how to maybe express that part of themselves. So one of the things I never do is ask men how they feel. Because they generally will reply with words like, okay, not bad, fine, all right, normal. And that's all they've got. So I think over the years, I've developed what I call an emotional fitness toolbox, almost in the sense that men need some tools to be able to open up and talk about their feelings.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. I think you talk in the book about, is it 6 responses that if you ask a man how they are, they'll give you a fixed menu. And one of them is, well, I'm normal. And I guess that leads that kind of some men not being able to articulate how they feel into quite a startling statistic, and that suicide is the leading cause of death for men under 35. That when I read that in your book, I've known the statistics for years, but putting it into context within what you're writing about really stood out for me. It's quite a stark it's quite a stark statistic, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's yes, absolutely. It's a kind of national shame, isn't it, that we don't want to talk about when we've got over 5,000 men every year taking their own lives just in the UK. Now, and I think there's lots of reasons. Lots of environmental reasons, social reasons, and I suppose in my book I'm really trying to hone in onto one aspect of that in terms of perhaps the construct of masculinity and what that has meant in terms of men expressing the full spectrum of emotions. And so often, what men have learned very early on is that it's not okay to express vulnerable emotions, and most men still, perhaps we call those weak emotions, and kind of trying therefore to kind of reduce or push against this stigma about, well, these feelings, this particular brand of feelings that we're not or we shouldn't express or feel.
Yes, absolutely. And it is a challenge. I think maybe there'll be a lot of men listening to this podcast who may be nodding along with you and saying that's exactly it. And one of the things that I was interested in, and something I've observed as both a student training to be a therapist many years ago and also as a trainer, was that men are underrepresented when it comes to counselling training. But they're overrepresented in every other aspect of life. And you kind of allude to, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the difficulty that men face could be a consequence of the fact there's so much male privilege. Did I read that correctly?
I'm not sure which bit you're referring to, but I think there's this sense, isn't there? I in terms of, we talk about privilege or position or power, that I think there's a kind of shoring up almost of masculinity within culture, and I think to be fair, some counselling modalities, that's where they go with working with men. We talked a little bit before we came on air about person-centeredness, and that's where I kind of base myself. And I think person-centeredness in the way that I practice, and particularly that first condition of making contact, is really key in terms of effectiveness of working with men. But it's also incredibly, I think, it's a challenge. A lot of people talk about person-centered therapy not being really challenging. Well, my view of that making contact, being and sitting with men in a room, in a clinic, in a kind of quite weird place, is really challenging to a kind of masculinity that has kind of been stuck in the world of rationality, and there's a kind of comfortability in that area and world for men. So some of the work I think in terms of therapy and in terms of emotional fitness is trying to unblock, unlearn some of those old views around masculinity.
Yes, and again, I kind of picked up on a theme in the book, which was that men will often, if you ask someone how are they, men will often come from a thinking position as opposed to a feeling position because of how they're socialised. Because in certain cultures, and I think it is changing. I mean, I speak as a child of the 70s. I grew up in the 70s, and where no one talked about the feelings, and if you did, you were considered a bit weird. And nowadays, I think it's changing. But that arc of time, I think, has been very challenging. And I think you're right. That first condition, that necessary and sufficient conditions for therapeutic change, which Rogers outlined in his 1957 paper in the Journal of Consulting Psychology, talks about the very first position being psychological contact. And a lot of people take that to be maybe someone who's got, maybe psychosis or under the influence of alcohol or narcotics or prescribed medication even. But actually, it is about making contact with someone. And that can be challenging. And you talk about the secret lives of men. So in terms of making that contact, what are some of the key emotional or psychological struggles that men experience but rarely articulate?
Well, I mean, I think there's many things there, and we could talk for a long time around this, I think. But I think for me, and increasingly for me, the two areas that come up for me quite a lot, and I've kind of developed a workshop around this, is shame and intimacy. So shame, I think, is what we it's an ongoing debate, and a really interesting debate about how we understand and work with shame. But if nothing else, it kind of constricts. It kind of keeps people apart and keeps them hidden. And I think there's this sort of almost this dirty secret. So shame isolates men. And the idea of, well, I might have, and this is what I find in working with men in groups. I've been running men's groups for many, many years. And it's almost like the group is a de-shaming area, because it's like a man will talk about something he may have not spoken about with another man in his life. And then all the other men are nodding along thinking, that's happened to me as well. So suddenly think, oh, this is not weird. I don't need to hold this shame. And the other area in terms of which I think goes along with this is in terms of, and we're touching on this in terms of the caring industry, or caring for self and caring for others. So one of the big things of course for men is that they don't really care for themselves physically. They have to be pushed to get to the GP. They don't and have not learned to care for themselves emotionally. So therefore, go to therapy? I don't need that kind of help. I'm sorted. I'm self-reliant. I'm okay. I can look after myself. I'm always that. And self-reliance, I think, is one of those undercurrent things that is a real way of moving away from ourselves and moving away from other people. So I think in terms of that kind of connection of if we're not kind of moving towards intimacy, which shame obviously prevents, then it means that we're not developing a good and close caring relationship with ourselves, but equally that's not happening with others, whether that's in a romantic sense or even in a friendship sense. And if we want to go back to what we were starting with about the suicide figures, one of the biggest issues for men and for women, but especially for men, is loneliness and isolation. And that we just feel alone because we dare not talk about some of the stuff that is going on for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly what I would, and I have experienced in my practice. As you were talking, I was replaying in my mind key times in my practice experience when men would reach out for help. And all of those cases tended to be when there was some big news program where men had been abused. The last time I remember was a football coach who'd been accused of abusing the young males in his charge. And it came to prominence. There was people talking about it. There was men on the TV who were in their middle age who were talking about reaching out, having to have therapy, having to talk about it. And within 48 hours, my email was pinging off the hook, my phone was ringing off the hook, and it was men reaching out for help. It was, and I don't say it's abnormal for men to reach out for help, but it was an abnormally high response rate. And I think it was generated by men being on the media, asking for help. I don't know if that would be your observation.
No, absolutely, and I think it's the chap's called Barry Bonnell or something like that. And I remember working actually right at that time with some of the men who he'd actually abused. I was working for a sport and charity at that time, for professional footballers, and absolutely there was it was for me just shocking hearing about this from first hand. But then, absolutely, in terms of the courage of those men to go on TV and say, yes, as a young boy and as a male, I have been abused by another male. And it's this almost like, and we, of course, many of us will know this stuff goes on, but to hear another man almost be brave enough to say that, it gives, and then this is what I mean partly about de-shaming. It's like, oh my God, yes, that's experienced me. And these, so it's almost modeling that, there's something wrong here and I want to talk about this. I want to actually get some help. So I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. And I guess that one of the barriers to that, you're talking about men not going to the GP or any other form of, which reminds me, I need to book an optician's appointment in the next after I've done this interview. Yeah. But do you still think that traditional expectations of masculinity shape the way men approach things such as relationships, vulnerability, and mental health support?
I think they're incredibly strong and difficult to break down. I mean, there's no doubt in my life, your life, when I was around, obviously in the 60s and 70s, what it looked like in terms of what the messages were telling us about being a boy and being a man. And there's a lot more breadth for young men now, I think, from different places. People are men, professional footballers and that, they're talking about mental health. So there's a lot more of that in terms of the media. But I think it's I suppose in my book I kind of map out some of the things that have happened over the last decades, like the New Man Project in the 70s and 80s. Then there was a backlash, and you've got the same almost today. You've got the kind of movement of men becoming maybe more caring, better fathers, more connected. Then we've got the whole woke thing going on. Let's slam that down again. Or the Andrew Tates come up again, and it goes on, and it's almost like the power of this cultural code of masculinity is so powerful, and this is what I mean by about being shored up, almost like some powerful kind of male figures have to keep shoring up this because if we let this go, there's this word which I've got a couple of sons and one son uses it occasionally. Being emasculated. That my power is going to be taken away, and I think that sort of sums up sometimes about the insecurity of this this construct of masculinity. And I think it's very difficult to just move away from that. And even in terms of some of my clients, I'm thinking particularly with couples, where you might think these young couples with children, they're equal parenting, they're really connected in many ways that they're doing. This is, blown apart, these old constructs. And yet, then when COVID comes along, we find out that actually it's the mothers who are expected to take the majority of childcare because the men will report that their job is big and more important. And so we found out through COVID that women had to kind of take on two jobs, the full-time job of the care and the mother and their busy work job as well. So I think they're really difficult to break down in reality.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think there's some women listening now who may very well say that it's not just in COVID. They still struggle with that sure. With that dynamic about work and child rearing and the father's role in that. I'm sure there's some very, very caring and empathic men who share parenting equally, but I think it's still, the balance is still shifted still shifted towards women. I'm interested that you bring up kind of masculine figures who are influencing the way that masculinity is thought about. Andrew Tate, for those of you who don't know him, is I use the term. I'm going to use the term very loosely here. Is an influencer, and his influence is. I would say my personal view is of high misogyny. The way he values and views women seems to be more like chattels than an equal relationship. But it's interesting, that form of masculinity is getting traction. Certainly was getting traction when I was a school counsellor, because some young male clients looked up to those kind of authority figures, and of course the rise of the access to pornography. I think that is a big thing. The way that women are portrayed in pornography, and its ease of access. I think. What's your view on that in terms of how that affects masculinity?
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, in my day, the only porn you could get would be in a magazine or something on the top shelf, if you could even reach or access it. And now it's on your phone. It's everywhere, isn't it? It's almost. I mean, they're saying that some young people, some teenagers, are viewing thousands of images within a year. It's just so accessible. And you're right. I think in terms of what we know about the porn industry, in terms of the abuse in the porn industry, and ultimately it's a performance. It's false. I often say it's a kind of mechanicalized idea of sex. There's no intimacy in porn. It's not about relationship, and so therefore we're now. And I'm increasingly again working with young men who have got a porn addiction, and it's impacting their sexual desire and their relationship, if they're in relationship with their partner, or they're not even interested in sex. So it's absolutely having a massive problem, and it doesn't seem that anybody wants to do anything about it. I think there was someone who reported about when America, I think before Trump, they were saying they were going to ban TikTok, and they can clearly do that. They can turn it off. And somebody was saying, I think a psychologist was saying, well, if they can do that, why don't they turn off Pornhub? Why won't they do that? Because they can do it if they want, but they don't. And therefore, there's a kind of reason. Of course, it's a commercial reason, I'm sure. But equally, it's having a devastating effect on young men all over the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting. I finished my practice with young people in 2016, but even then, it was coming up more and more in conversations, and it was. Interestingly enough, it wasn't just affecting relationships that young people were having; it was affecting the relationship they were having with their mothers, and that was a massive impact where they were viewing all women through just one particular prism, and their female teachers as well.
Sure. Well, it's interesting you say that, because I think that's kind of this idea of the women and the body objectification. Of course, that all of that was around before porn. And I think, in terms of, I talk about this a little bit in my book about the confusion for boys as teenagers with the hormone effect, and then almost like they're moving in terms of their relationship with their mother, and then sexual objectification. So you've got this sense of that, as a boy, they're really connected to their mother, they're loving and they're caring. And then they're hearing this story when they get to school, don't be a mummy's boy. And then, maybe messages from other boys, I want to have sex with your mother, or being attracted to mothers. And this confusion kind of is what I call the kind of intimacy break. It's almost like it creates this break of, okay, Can I have intimacy with a woman without having sex? Or are women just there for sex? They're just an object to ogle, to have the male gaze, as it were, that they are almost like that. It's my right to look at them and their body and to lust after them. And then, of course, we then lead into, and with all that power of porn, which we've been talking about, and of course, sexual abuse and rape and all those kind of things comes from perhaps our inability, or what the media have been sowing us. I mean, in my day, it was like page 3 in the Sun, even just a nude woman, and it's like idea of, well, this is okay, is it? Just to look at a nude woman in a national newspaper. Yes. It's but that's where we were.
I mean, that's quite a remarkable thing to think about. I mean, perhaps people who are listening who may be younger than us, James, won't appreciate the impact of that. But you could buy a national newspaper that was available to purchase at any newsagent, or you can even get someone who posted it through your letterbox. We had post boys and girls in those days. And on the third page, there was half a page taken up by a semi-naked woman. And it was considered quite acceptable. And it was only through the pressure of women's groups and societal change in general that kind of disappeared, and what followed arguably is a lot worse. But yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon. And then of course you're talking in the book about the nuts generation, the lads mag generation, and that type of thing, which again. Just took it to another level. Yeah, no, absolutely. This idea that, look, we're just going to be lads. This is what lads do, and I think this whole area of the lads culture, which has not really decreased in this idea of, they talk about what goes on tour stays on tour, or banter in the cloakrooms, the changing rooms, and when we listen into that, we're hearing language about each other, perhaps, but equally about women, that is incredibly distasteful and is objectifying women, sexual objects. So these are still the young men as well. So it's almost like how to break, almost like the idea of, this is what we should do as men. This is just having a laugh. And so that idea of men, and I think I talk about this in the book a little bit, about how difficult it is to grow up. How difficult it is to grow up emotionally, and being able to take responsibility for our language, our behavior, and our feelings. And I think that, for me, is a big part of growth in masculinity, is responsibility. Wherever I am, whatever I'm doing, can I take responsibility for my emotions, my behavior, and my language? Yes, and I think as we come to the end of our time together, that's exactly what I took away from the book. I also wonder how many of the book will be bought by women and giving it to their male partners, as a way of saying, have a look at that, and let's have a look at this.
I think you're right, Rory. That's exactly why I bought it. I wrote it. I bought it as well, but I wrote it. The idea that men will typically buy books to research about themselves, or about women, or things like perimenopause or menopause, or women's sexuality. Women do that. They buy huge amounts of books about men, relationships, development. And so, yes, the book is written for men. It is written for women to read and learn about the secret lives of men, but equally for them to work on that together. And for me, it's a really easy, I hope you found it, accessible book, with lots of things that, takeaways ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. The Secret Lives of Men is available at bookstores and online retailers if you want to explore it further. To find a link to the book in the show notes for this episode, head over to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab and look for episode 335. And we'll put links to the book and links to James's bio, and you'll be able to go and view those and have a look at the book. So, James, thank you for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Massive thank you to James Hawes. Thank you to you, Rory, for holding those all important discussions. That was Practice Matters. We now move on to student services and an interesting topic today, how to start a counselling session with a client. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting. And it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counselingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counselingskillsacademy.com. Now, I just want to understand this, Rory. Are you saying how to start a very first counselling session with a client? You've never seen this client before, or is it third time they're visiting and how you begin the counselling session?
Well, I think it's how we start. How we start. It would be the first session, but it could be follow-on sessions as well. And what I'm coming to is that when we're thinking about how to start our session off, client walks in, sits down, we've done our contracting. How do we start? What do we say to clients? Do we say anything at all? And I think the best thing to think about is thinking about this from the client's frame of reference. If you're a student, your client will have had to go to an agency, will have had to sit in front of someone, be assessed, talk about the very difficult things in their lives. Then they'll be told they'll get a counselling session, but it could be in the future. So then they have to sit and wait, and what's going on in their lives will be playing out around them, or what's troubling them will still be with them. And then eventually they'll get a text or an email or a letter or a phone call to say, come in and see you. And here's the thing, they've not, generally speaking, they've not done a counselling course. They're seeing a counsellor, yeah? And it doesn't matter if you're a student counsellor, you are their counsellor. So when they come in, they may be unsure or unsettled or not quite understanding what happens next. So, how do you start? Client sits down, you've done your contracting, what do you say to them? And it's a question I asked one of my tutors many years ago when I was studying, because I wanted to be respectful and thoughtful and not get it wrong. And it was quite interesting what my tutor said to me. She said, well, you've got a number of paths. You can say, how can I help you today? Where do we start? Or sometimes you'll just sit up and take a breath, and your clients will just start telling you their story. They're so eager to get all this pain out and to have someone hear them that they might start without, any kind of prompt. But I think it's very, very different to skills practice. I've talked about this quite often in the podcast. The transition from using skills as a student with your peers in a classroom, it's a massive step change to sitting in front of a client who doesn't know the rules of therapy, who's not studied to be a therapist, who has real pain and real difficulty. And how do you get to a point where because I've always said, if you start well, you're going, first impressions and the whole hat. If you start well, you're more likely to have a good, long engagement with clients. So it really is. So it's really a bit of a chat about how we start. How we start therapy. What do we say, Ken?
Yes, I like it. I think it's a really good topic. We spoke only last week about the very how doing your skills is so different to when you're in a real therapeutic contact, and how the client doesn't have the rules of engagement. In your simulated skill sessions, when you break out and you've got 20 minutes to practice skills, you sit down and you say to the person, what do you want to bring today? And bam, they're off, and they'll bring a narrative. And with clients, it is not always that way, and it can be that way. And you're going to, I think that your first sessions with clients are going to be as different and as unique as the clients that you see. And I think that's a really good starting point, is to not have any expectations of what the beginning may be like, because it can vary, and it can vary from I don't know what to say and I don't really know what to bring, and a client being at a loss of how to describe what's going on for them, to the other side of the coin, which you mentioned, Rory, and that's that immediate sharing, almost like a champagne cork coming off, and you just have this narrative that flows at you, and you would handle both situations differently, and we'll maybe get to how we might handle those in a moment. But the place I go with this is I think about what you mentioned, Rory, the frame of reference, the mindset, how it is for the client coming in. So I think of it this way. If you're going through some trouble in your life and it's really, really difficult, very often, and this doesn't apply to everyone, but very often, it's kind of hidden away inside. We don't tell people about it. We don't tell our work colleagues about it. It affects our day to day, but it's something that we keep internally. And it can often be that when a client sits in front of you, they're speaking about this for the very first time. And not only that, they're speaking about it for the very first time with someone they've never met before. Someone that they are viewing maybe as someone that can help. So they're going through this process, which is a painful process, to delve into that pain, to go and look at that pain, thinking about what the mindset of that person may be before going in. The night before, when they're considering, I'm going to be seeing my counselor tomorrow, and they might be reviewing what it is that they're bringing in, what material they're bringing in. And I just see it as a privileged position to be there to receive that information. But also we need to recognize that we need to perhaps allow time to build up trust and not rush a client into a narrative. So if a client does come and say, I'm really nervous, I don't really know what to say, we can be kind, understanding, and just there for the client in a warm way. Sometimes people will need a relationship to develop first before they feel that they can share. And then, like I started with, on the other side of the coin, there is that instant narrative where, I guess, as a placement counsellor, you might feel, I better stop them so that I can get some skills in here and a quick reflection. I did this. And sometimes it's just about letting the client vent, letting them vent and get the whole story out. So from my side, it is always different. And the clients will teach us, but gently, not expecting. And when I say not expecting, you can have a referral through, and I remember this and taking it to my supervisor back in the day when I was in placement. I was in a GP practice, and the doctor would make the referrals and would give me an indication of what the referral was for. This person wants to see you for this reason. And thanks to my supervisor, I stopped looking at this reason after a while, because I didn't want to have the expectation, when are they going to start talking about this that I know is what's brought them in? I was almost maybe wanting them to rush to something they'd shared with the doctor where they weren't ready, because they maybe had a relationship with the doctor, and I was this stranger that they'd just met. So there's just some ramblings and top-of-the-mind thoughts, Rory, from my side.
Yes, thank you for that, Ken. And I think it's interesting. You touched on referrals. And in my early career, I was very much, I don't want to read the referral. Unless there's an element of risk, harm to self or harm to others. I want to hear this from the client. And as I kind of matured in my practice, I took a slightly different view. And my view is that I always read the referrals, Because if a client came to you and they had maybe a history of sexual abuse, maybe a history of domestic violence, they may say to you, do you know my background? And if you say, well, no, they may have to tell you all over again and recount that pain and recount that difficulty. So I would say, to them in my later career, I would say, yes, I've read the referral. And is it about that you want? Is that why you're here? And they may say, well, no, actually, I've come about something else. But 9 times out of 10, it was yes. So I think being thoughtful of saving the client the trauma of retelling another professional, because they may have had to tell their story a number of times. People forget this. By the time someone sees a counsellor, they may have had to go through a number of professionals. In cases of sexual assault and sexual abuse, they may have had to speak in court. They may have had to speak to a solicitor. They may have had to speak to a doctor. They may have had to speak to the police. And every time they re-discuss this or re-bring this up, it's re-traumatizing. So my observation would be, read the referral, but I'm definitely with you, Ken. Don't have an expectation that what's in the referral is what's going to be discussed in the therapy room.
Yeah. Yes. And the opening line of what is it that you would like to bring today worked well for me. So yes. You've done your contracting. You've said who you are. You've spoken about your modality. So we're putting all of the bookends out of the way here. So with that said, we have about 50 minutes left for this session. And I wonder what it is that you'd like to bring today. Is a beautiful invite.
It is. That's lovely.
It just lays a little welcome mat out.
Yes.
And it's a very clear indicator that it's your turn as the client. And then it really is just about going where the client goes. Well, for me, I practiced, when I was in practice, it was person-centered modality. So I would be going with the client wherever they chose to go, as opposed to directing that. And it would be different every time. It really would. I want to just touch on future sessions. Well, what I mean by future sessions is when the client comes back. So we've spoken about this being the first session. But when the client comes back in, you see them for the next week. Let's say week 1, you say, I wonder what it is that you'd like to bring today. And they speak for 35 minutes non-stop, giving you a narrative of what's been going on for them and how it's been, and a whole lot of narrative. It's where do you pick up in the next session? How do you open that next session when you have all of this information that they brought in the last session? So have a think about that, and I'll share my thought on it. My thought on it is that I don't. I just lay out the same welcome mat, and I wonder what it is that you'd like to dive into today. And the reason for that is I don't want to set the agenda. So I don't want to say, well, last time you said this and this and this and this, so let's dig deeper, because they might have had a terrible morning with somebody on the bus who took their seat and they're really angry about that. So it's what are they coming in with and where do they find themselves in that moment? And sometimes somebody might mention something as they're leaving therapy. They might mention something, next time I come, I might want to speak to you about my relationship with my mother. And then in the next session, I might say, as you checked out last week, you mentioned that you'd like to at some stage speak to your mother, but that's up to you when you choose to bring it. I wonder what it is that you'd like to bring today. And again, just handing it softly over to them. No expectations from my side, but at least kind of linking together what they may have mentioned in the last session, but they may have forgotten about that and have something completely different that they've been planning all night to bring into therapy and building up the courage to bring in. And I don't want to destabilize that. What's your thoughts, Rory?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you, Ken. I think that let the client set the agenda. I used to say in subsequent sessions, it's good to see you. Make sure they settled in and say, so where would you like to begin, or where would you like to start, or where do we start? And that it's usually an interesting invitation for a client to then talk about what they wanted. And I think you make a very, very valid point. You might have on the first session someone who brings something incredibly heavy, incredibly powerful, and you think this has to be what the therapy is about. They come the next week and we say, well, what would you like to bring today? Or, it's good to see you. And they talk about something different. And what you have to do, certainly as a person-centered therapist, is put the first session to one side, bracket it, and work with what is being presented today. Because it may be, and we know that clients do this, is that you may have been tested. In other words, that first session could have been a test to make sure that you're resilient enough to hear the story. The times I've had clients say to me, I don't want to tell you my story because I'm afraid it might upset you. I've had that on a number of occasions. Yeah. My story is so bad, it's devastated me, and I don't want it to do that to anybody else. And on that point, I think I would say I really appreciate that and I really understand that, but it's fine. I will be fine with it. Share when you're ready, and give them the impression that you're robust enough to do it. Because what will happen in clients' lives is people will shun them. They'll try to tell their story to a person on the bus, or a person in the queue for the newspaper, or someone at work. And people who are not trained therapists will either change the subject, or it'll touch on material that they've experienced in their life, and they'll shy away. And when they come to a therapist, almost certainly they'll feel that that's going to happen to them. So it's always useful to think about, if someone's brought something in the first session and you're not talking about it in the second, just be patient, just wait, because it may be they're just waiting for the time where they're feeling comfortable to be able to talk about the kind of real issue that's going on for them. It's a bit of a waiting game sometimes.
Yes. You mentioned having to repeat a story many times over, and I've worked in services where certainly we would be seeing service users who went through that process of having to tell their stories many times over, and there can be, in some cases, almost a rehearsed narrative around. Let me tell you about what's happened to me in the last 20 years. And I'm going to tell you in 3 minutes, and it can come across quite without emotion. It can almost seem like a removed story, almost speaking of someone else, and it can come from the hardening of having to talk about your presentation again and again and again. So there's another first presentation that you might see. And it's a protection mechanism. It's a protection mechanism for all the reasons that you've just mentioned, Rory. You're telling the story again and again and again. You're getting all these different kinds of inputs. And have you tried this? And did you do this? And why didn't you do that? And I would have done that. And well, let me tell you what happened to me. All of that goes on. But now, for the first time, this person is in your therapeutic setting where you are receiving that information in a different way, with kindness, openness, and seeing the whole of that person with a deep level of empathy. And I think we're talking, I want to speak about counseling skills for a moment. In that first session, I think the counseling skills that are most often used are active listening and silence. Often, not always, but often.
Yes.
Active listening and silence. And I just wrote something this morning around active listening. Active listening is the first skill you learn. You go to start a counseling course where you're going to be taught about active listening. I think it's one of the most difficult skills to master. I think that the true mastery of active listening sits in a seasoned counsellor or psychotherapist who's been in practice where their clients have taught them and they've heard so much. I think we mature into active listening, and I think it's trickier than it's a simple skill that is very, very difficult to master, but it is incredibly powerful. So in the situation that I mentioned of a person maybe coming in and they have a prepared narrative that they've told maybe dozens of times to professionals before, I wonder how many times they've truly been listened to, as opposed to somebody listening so that they can write it down or make a note or file that away somewhere or put a label on that person. So that's my thoughts on the skills in those early session, that first session, Rory.
Yeah, it's beautifully put, Ken. And I think I'd add to that by saying that also it's about the therapist, the counsellor being present. Active listening, I think a big part of that is someone being present, that they are giving 100% attention to the person sat in front of them. And not only that, that person can get a sense of that, they can feel it. And when that happens, I think that's when the therapeutic magic starts to take place, where someone realizes that there's someone there for them, just to listen to them. And I think there's no better service one human being can offer another. Quite frankly,
Yeah.
it's one of the greatest services that as humans we can offer another.
Yes. I just wanted to circle back to one more thing. I could speak for a very long time
Yeah,
on
no.
this. I wanted to circle back to a client that may come in and speak for 35, 40 minutes, just giving a narrative and this and this and this and this and this and this. In active listening, the next part, when that client leaves the session, good note-taking skills become quite important. Because you're right, Rory, we wouldn't go into session 2 expecting that they're now going to recover some of that ground. They may bring something completely different. But if they do start recovering some of the ground, if we've taken good notes and we look at that before the client comes in again, then we're able to show that we listened actively the first time by understanding and knowing and nodding and being aware of what the person is bringing, so that we understand the key players and the key events and the key emotions in that person's life. It's amazing, isn't it? We started speaking about how to start a counselling session, and we're now on to note-taking.
Yes. Well, we started at the beginning and finished at the end, Ken.
We did, yes, and it's interesting. We've got loads of stuff, free resources on this on counsellingtutor.com. If you look up note-taking, if you look up first counselling session in our search bar, you're going to find a whole lot of stuff. And if you're a member of our student library, we call it Counselling Study Resource. It's a student library packed with resources. We've got a lot of information on counselling skills, on first sessions, on note-taking. So lots of information. If you're a member of that, log in and check it out. Do some searches in the dashboard. And if you're not a member, just go to counsellingtutor.com. There's free stuff there, or you can join the student resource from there as well. All the links are there. And that is Student Services. And this has been episode 335 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, we started with ethical, sustainable practice and extra-therapeutic factors in supervision. The external life or the external mechanisms of a client's life and how that might be brought into supervision to support therapeutic outcomes. In Practice Matters, an interview with James Hawes, who spoke about supporting and connecting with male clients. And then in Student Services, me and Ken had a ramble around starting a counselling session and the mechanisms of kind of inciting permission and providing that therapeutic space, that soil of a different kind, as Carl Rogers kindly reminds us, so a client can talk about the difficulties in their life. I'd like to thank you for your support and your subscriptions and your shares. We would like to thank you for that, kind of myself. They mean the world to us, and we just love it when people share on social media or tweet, if people tweet nowadays, or X, or just share it with peers. We love that. So until next time, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.